Hello and welcome to The Shane Show. I'm Shane Connick. Today we're going to bring in the former managing editor of Education Week, a company where she worked for over 23 years. She was also a former staff writer at the Washington Post and is now a professor in the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland. An alumna of George Mason University and the University of Virginia, Miss Kathleen Kennedy Manzo. Professor Manzo, welcome to The Shane Show. Thank you for coming on today.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So I was just talking about how you went to George Mason University and then University of Virginia eventually after. When you were at George Mason, you went there originally and you played soccer, and you were a member of its inaugural women's soccer team. That season in 1982, the team was as high as number 6 in the nation. And the team basically went from being in 1981 a club sport to being a national power within a year. That first year, team went 14-4-1, was number 8 in the nation at the end of the regular season, had 14 freshmen on the team, and so basically, and then faced Princeton in the first round of the tournament. So you sign up and you're going to go from Long Island down to Virginia to go and play soccer for a team in its inaugural season. Could you have possibly envisioned the season that you ended up having?
No, and actually it's a funny story. I was going to another school up until the end of June of after I graduated high school. I was going to go to the University of Connecticut, which was second in the country at that point. I probably had little chance of starting, and I got a call from George Mason. The coach was new and was, trying to pull a team together for that inaugural season. He said, "You will definitely start. You will definitely play. We're going to, really make some history." And, it was kind of a pipe dream for him, I thought, but we worked really hard. We had a really scruffy and scrappy group of women who just wanted to play, and we synced really well, and we just had a fantastic season.
And outside of at George Mason, I know that you majored in communications. What are some other things that you did there in order to further your journalism career?
Yeah, so after I left the soccer team, I had a little bit more time to pursue my other interests, and I joined the student newspaper, The Broadside, and I was the sports editor there. And that was just a great experience. I really found my tribe, and that's when I knew I wanted to go into journalism. George Mason's basketball team was doing really well at that time, so I got to go to some really fantastic games. They went to the NIT tournament for the first time, and I was able to cover that. And that really helped me parlay that experience into a position at the Washington Post, which was also quite a pipe dream. And I was a news aide in the sports department at a time when there weren't a lot of women in sports reporting. And it was just a great opportunity for me to get in there. I covered a lot of high school sports. At one point covered Mia Hamm playing at Lake Braddock High School in Fairfax, Virginia. And it just really fueled my passion for journalism. And because I was covering high school students mostly, it really intrigued me about education and, child development. And from there, I went into education journalism.
And so you were talking about your time at the Washington Post. Now, right after you left George Mason, graduating in 1986, in September 21st, specifically, 1986, you published a story in the Washington Post about George Mason women's soccer and a big win that it had over number 8 Wisconsin. So what was it like to cover a program and a school that meant so much to you right after leaving for a nationally acclaimed paper?
Yeah, very good reporting you did there, Shane. And thanks for the trip down memory lane. I remember that because, I was trying to get as many assignments as I could when I was working in the sports department. And the sports editor at the time, Len Shapiro, thought it was quite a novel idea to send me to a game for George Mason. And I told him, I played there. I have a little bit of a conflict of interest. And he said, "No, you don't. You can do it. And just go and cover the game like you should." And it took a little bit of the excitement out of the game for me, frankly. It was the first game I went back to watch after I had been on the team. But I just covered it right down the middle. From what I saw, kind of detached myself from my connection to the team. But, at the end of the game, I did go say hi to my friends, and I believe they won that game, right?
Yeah, I believe it was 1-0.
Yeah, but it was exciting to me that I could then, take the skills that I had gained at George Mason and really do turn it around and do some good in covering high school and college sports professionally.
And for the next few years, and you touched on this earlier about education, you were writing for the Post about local government, schools, and high school sports for daily and weekly sections before eventually joining Black Issues in Higher Education, Community College Weekly blog, and eventually Education Week. All these are different education publications, and you did, as I said, covered a little bit of education even with the Post. Now, once you joined Ed Week, I know that you also attended the University of Virginia to study the social foundations of education. So at that point, were you basically interested in being a teacher like you eventually became in 2020, or was it more of kind of just you were really interested in covering or just about the subject of education itself?
Yeah, so when I was at the Washington Post, I tried to expand, my expertise beyond sports, and I covered a lot of school issues, school events, um, school board meetings, and I just found it fascinating, that whole world, and I realized I knew nothing about it. So I decided to go back to University of Virginia and get my master's in social foundations, which is not a practical degree. It's not for you to become a teacher. It's the politics and philosophy and history of education. And I thought, having that deep background and context would really help me to become a better education reporter. And, I was right. I was able to then, take that experience and, go and cover issues of equity and diversity in higher education with Black Issues, which is now called Diverse, and the whole community college world. And that, took me around the country to community colleges, in Appalachia, on Native American reservations in all parts of the country. And ultimately, I wanted to cover K-12, and I was able to turn that into an opportunity at Education Week, which gave me that chance to cover that world, mostly from the policy perspective, but again, that took me to hundreds of schools all over the country to talk with educators and school district leaders and experts. And I was surprised that I had that kind of vision for covering something so deeply, but ultimately it was the right path.
And what were some kinds of cool lessons and things that you learned from being in these classrooms, working with maybe interviewing students, interviewing teachers? What are some cool lessons and things that you just learned from being around that?
Yeah. Well, most people think they know a lot about education, and they think they know how a school functions, how a school should function, um, what teaching is all about, because they've gone to school or their kids have gone to school. And when you go to a number of different schools in different places, you can see a lot of the similarities. Certainly schools operate in a lot of the same ways anywhere you go, even internationally. I visited schools in Japan and was surprised at the similarities. But there's also a lot of complexity, and it's not easy. And it's not, a black and white, do this, don't do that. You're dealing with individual children who have different needs and personalities, and you're trying to nurture the best in all of them and get them to their potential. And that you cannot do by script, and you cannot do by a step-by-step. And it's every day something different. And it is kind of an all-consuming profession. So it gave me a lot more respect for teachers and people who lead schools and school districts, and all the complications and challenges as they're trying to do best by every child.
And so eventually, what made you decide to, years later, actually start to teach yourself, teaching intro to news writing and reporting at the Philip Merrill College of Journalism as late as actually just this past semester in January 2020?
Yeah, so was a bucket list thing. When I did my master's, I did kind of have in the back of my head, I would love to, at some point in my career, be on a college campus on a regular basis. Just so much energy and, exuberance and fresh ideas and idealism. So, throughout my career, I was pretty busy and, thought of teaching at a college as something that would take a lot of time, which is true. But, I finally got to a point where I thought, I really want to do this. And I reached out to the University of Maryland, and they were really eager for professionals who were active in the field to come and teach. So I did have that opportunity this past spring, which was very interesting because the first part of the semester, as you know, was in person, and it was awesome. And then we very quickly had to move online for the second half of the semester. So it challenged me as a newbie instructor, still trying to develop my skills to now move it online. And we did the rest of the semester on Zoom. I invited a lot of working journalists as guests to talk with these aspiring journalists. And I think it worked out pretty well. It was just an amazing experience that I hope to do again in the near future.
And I have to say, because it's got to be tough, because you've been working with teachers for such a long time and all that. But no matter how frequently, how much you worked with these teachers, no one can prepare to explain to you if a global pandemic happens and you have to have all online classes. There would be no real way to even prepare for that, even if you have years and years of experience. So.
Very, very true. Somebody told me yesterday, the way they see the world of teaching right now is everybody is a first-year teacher. And I think that's true in a lot of ways.
And speaking of the new things that are happening this year in 2020, a big question that's dominating television shows and the news today is, should schools reopen? If they open, what do they do? We see some schools trying to have some sort of hybrid plan, kids going to school for half a day, kids going to school for just going to school and seeing what happens, socially distant classrooms. And it's a lot of controversy because in reality, there really are no right or wrong answers because this is such an unprecedented situation. What are your thoughts on what schools should do, especially when you look at, you were talking about covering K through 12, when you look at elementary schools and elementary school kids having to wear masks? When, I remember when I was in elementary school, the whole thing is you'd be sitting on the carpet and interacting and going to, my favorite subject was recess and gym class and running around and all that. And now you're just eliminating that and forcing them to do things that are so unnatural. What are your thoughts overall on schools reopening and with the crazy situation that we have this fall?
Yeah, well, it's really complicated. And anyone who's lived through the trends of fidget spinners or silly bands knows that elementary school kids, they don't always follow the rules. They don't always know where their hands are, and they're fidgeting with something. And masks, I can imagine, would be the thing they'd be fidgeting with. Look, schools everywhere just have an impossible algorithm to figure out here. They have to keep kids safe. They want to serve kids as best they can. Kids aren't getting back their first grade year or their second grade year or their senior year. So they've got to figure out how to make it as meaningful and productive as possible, how to ensure that they are learning what they need to learn so that they can progress. Not necessarily in a linear fashion. Not everybody progresses at the same time, but you don't want to leave kids behind because they're learning in this unprecedented situation. So it definitely should be a local decision, with guidance from states to school districts about what's the situation in your area and what makes the most sense, whether it's, you know, in school for a couple of days a week or in smaller groups, whether it's a hybrid model, whether it's all online through the middle of September, which a lot of people are, a lot of places are doing, and then adjust, you know, as the situation warrants. You know, the other question is, you know, how much of the school's time and attention and resources goes to things like logistics and operations and those things around keeping the place clean and safe, and then what about teaching and learning? So kind of balancing those needs is going to be really tricky. So you know, I really feel for the people who are working in schools. They have a big task ahead. I think they know that, you know, it's got to be done. They got to figure something out. You know, I guess in the end, we'll see what happens on the other side.
And so you mentioned earlier that teaching, after covering education, covering different things in the field of journalism for such a long time, that teaching was kind of a bucket list thing for you that you were able to accomplish this past spring. Another thing that now you're starting to get involved with is working with Finn Partners as a senior partner in the field basically of strategic communications. I know that you study primarily communications at George Mason, but is being working in strategic communications like you are now another thing that you kind of look to do at some point?
Yeah, I always saw it as, you know, a really good way to parlay the skills that I had as a journalist, which, you know, journalists are, you know, really good at a lot of things that are very valuable outside of journalism. And telling people stories is a big part of that. So I had always thought that there were other opportunities outside of journalism. And, you know, in the situation I'm in now, what's really nice is I'm now able to expand again beyond education, so that I'm delving into some issues that are really important to me: women's economic empowerment, consumer product safety, um, internet access, you know, bridging the digital divide for all around the world, some other issues related to child development, you know, outside of education and health. So it's giving me an opportunity to work with really interesting organizations that are doing great work, and to help them tell their story, which, you know, one thing I learned as a journalist is a lot of organizations that have great stories to tell don't necessarily know how to tell them. So it's good to have a partner to help them do that.
Professor Manzo, always great to talk to you, and I appreciate you coming on to the show today.
Thank you. It was nice talking to you, Shane.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning into this edition of The Shane Show. We'll see you next time. Catch you on the flip side.